Underwater combat is a very peculiar part of Monster Hunter franchise's history. The vast majority of the community never actually experienced it, and every time it is mentioned, the ones that did more often than not describe it in a negative way. And yet, its return is amongst the most wanted features requested by fans, old and new alike. So what is the deal with this barely seen mechanic? What is the source of this apparent contradiction, and will it truly come back in Wilds? Let's talk about it. Underwater combat was a system introduced in Monster Hunter Tri as well as its expansion 3 Ultimate all the way back in 2009 and 2011 respectively, and to this day it is still the only entry in the series with such functionality. This exclusive gameplay element added a completely new perspective of how we play these games. So here's how it worked. On some maps, players had the ability to dive into large bodies of water. In them, resources could be gathered, most being only found in underwater areas, and of course, monsters could be hunted. That last part is important, because even though resource harvesting functioned pretty much the same way as on land, combat, on the other hand, didn't. While submerged, players had the access to a significantly different moveset, except lance of course, which despite keeping the same weapons niche and playstyle, the alteration of attack moves plus the three-dimensionality of fighting in water offered a substantially distinct combat experience. Unfortunately though, its inclusion was a bit of a mess, with many players categorizing it as clunky and restrictive, which is a very big problem. We cannot forget that 3rd gen is substantially old at this point, and combat, being on land or water, was still pretty clunky even if we compare it to 4th generation. So hearing people say that underwater combat was clunky even back then is a huge deal, and perhaps that's the main reason for not being seen in the franchise ever since. However, people still want it back. That is kinda odd, don't you think? You dislike a feature and want it again anyway? Sounds a bit contradictory. But in reality, it does in fact mean something else. You see, this paradox, as one would call it, actually shows that the problem isn't really the concept of underwater combat, but rather its poor execution in Tri. Players seem to like the idea of fighting underwater, and it is understandable why. It allows new monster types that would be otherwise impossible to exist in the game being introduced to the series and provide players with fresh combat experiences. It enriches the world of Monster Hunter by showcasing aquatic ecosystems and basically lets us do what we enjoy doing the most, hunting, in more ways than one. The major issue that Tri and 3 Ultimate had was just bad implementation. But what exactly made it so bad though? I myself played Tri about a year ago and it was an amazing experience. The whole atmosphere and theme was incredibly enjoyable overall, and I would even argue that game did some aspects of the series better than any other title after it, including 5th gen, namely preparation, pacing and economics, but that was already mentioned before so I won't go into detail when it comes to that. Regarding underwater combat, my own experience was not the norm per se. Let me explain. From my understanding, Lance was the weapon that suffered the system shortcomings the least. Its gameplay barely changed between land and water, and it actually felt pretty decent on both terrains, so in the end it is not a good example to represent how underwater hunting actually felt for most players, and since that was the only weapon I used throughout my entire playthrough, I don't believe I'm qualified to give a proper perspective of how it feels and present an expectation to the majority of the community. But from other people's opinion that played the game semi-recently, it is not all that bad, but it could be a lot better. Now, I do have some ideas as to why this particular mechanic was so underwhelming, and my main suspect is movement. Three-dimensional traversal was something that Capcom never did prior to 3rd generation. Generally, movement in games is surprisingly difficult to do right, believe it or not, and despite the devs having succeeded on that until then, adding an extra dimension to movement is exponentially more complicated. Add that to the technological limitation at the time, this was in 2009 after all, and it is understandable that they had such a bad time implementing this feature. But while Try was their first, well, try in multidimensional movement, it was not the last one. Many years later, they would dive into it once again with the latest entry to the series, Monster Hunter Rise. Aquatic combat and wire bugs, despite their obvious differences, both introduce gameplay elements in a 3D space. The latter, however, in my opinion at least, does that multi-layered movement in a much better way and in fact fixes practically all the problems underwater had when it comes to traversal. Moving while submerged is slow, very slow, and if you want to swim at an acceptable pace, you will need to use stamina, which is a problem when you're facing monsters perfectly adapted for this environment no less, and thus they are a lot more maneuverable than you. In those situations, dodging is an extremely valuable resource, a resource that also uses stamina, a lot of it in fact. The conjunction of both these factors forces players to make a decision. Use sprint swim as little as possible and mainly dash to avoid the monster, or constantly reposition yourself but you will barely be able to dodge due to your stamina. While this adds strategy to the hunt itself and as such it should be a good thing in theory, there's a problem here. Dodges underwater function differently to their terrestrial counterparts. On land, you can roll at pretty much any direction that you want with zero limitations. In water though, your dodges are reduced to only 4 predetermined directions: up, down, forward and backwards. You can't even dash sideways from a neutral position. You need to redirect your character and dodge forward to the left or right. Not only that, your dashes are painfully slow, making it very easy to get hit. All of this makes underwater combat extremely restrictive, and while I do understand that fighting aquatic monsters in its natural habitat is part of the fear factor in Try, this sort of unresponsive movement is very frustrating. It feels like you are trapped by something, and thus takes away the enjoyment of hunting. Wire bugs solves all these issues. Dashes are extremely quick, you can wirebug to practically any direction and multiple times, and most importantly, this mechanic is directly integrated to Rise's combat, something that Try didn't do. Keep in mind that I'm not saying that we should have underwater wirebugs or something like that to solve these problems. Plus I believe Rise also went a bit overboard with the flexibility of its movement, but its implementation showed that now Capcom has the expertise and technology to do this all mechanic justice. But how would they do it to make fun to play with? That is actually pretty simple. Let's imagine for a second that Wilds has underwater combat. How would they improve upon it? The basics of swimming are already there and are pretty good. All they need to change is make sprint swimming a tiny bit faster and it's perfect. Turning though needs a lot of work. Changing directions, especially while sprinting, takes a long time and by the time you do it, you cross a very large distance already. That doesn't feel good. Adding more flexibility by enabling players to turn quickly and on the spot, aka you immediately switch from one direction to the other like wirebugs in Rise, would make it not just more enjoyable to navigate overall, but would also improve combat positioning during a hunt by creating more responsive and flexible controls and thus feel a lot less restrictive than in the third generation. When it comes to dashes, being able to do it in any direction is a given to say the least. But on top of that, dodges could also benefit immensely from wirebugs' functionality. The travel distance was not really the issue, but rather its speed. Speeding it up does solve the problem, but doesn't necessarily make it fun or engaging though. So, to fix that, there are two things we can do to make underwater dashes feel better to execute and also improve the combat itself. Number 1, allowing players to dash multiple times in succession and in separate directions. This on its own would let hunters navigate while fighting a monster in creative ways and thus expand the skill expression of underwater combat. That would be a massive plus. But here's the caveat. Allowing players to dash too often would cause a huge balance problem, since that puts players in a tremendous advantage. So we need to limit how many times and how often we can use them. One alternative for that is the use of an exclusive resource like wirebugs do, or we can just use stamina. Honestly, I'm not a big fan of either option. The former is a bit of a gamified solution and doesn't completely fit the immersive nature of Monster Hunter games. That's one of the reasons why a lot of people didn't like wirebugs to begin with, and the latter can be abused with dash juice or other stamina focused skills. But maybe to fix this problem, all we need to do is something very simple. Making dodges cost stamina is overall better than the alternative, and to prevent the potential exploit of such resource through skills and consumables, the devs could implement a hard-coded limit to dashes, making it so no matter how much stamina you have, players can only dodge twice in a row, and perhaps they could even expand on that, implementing a new skill that allows players to dash 3 times instead of 2. If the cooldown lengths between dashes is long enough, I believe that this is the best approach to make this multi-dodge mechanic balanced. And number 2, assign attacks to the dodges themselves. This way, combat would feel a lot more fluid even if we dash more often than on land. It could even allow Capcom to bring back old attack moves or create new ones. Now, this one also has its issues. One thing that we can't overlook is that combat both on land and underwater cannot vary in depth or complexity, as that would eventually make one inferior to the other and generate a meta where players will force hunts to be done exclusively in a specific type of terrain. So to compensate for the extra moves we have available while dashing underwater, all weapons would have a limited moveset just like Tri did. Imagine Striker style in Generation's Ultimate, but instead of having Hunter Arts, we have dash moves. With all these changes, I thoroughly believe that underwater combat would be drastically improved and contain none of the problems Tri's iteration had. But here's the thing. Personally, I don't think we will see this mechanic return in Wilds. Capcom knows very well how wanted this mechanic is, and they would 100% capitalize on that by advertising it front and center right from the first trailer back in December. The mirror reflection on the logo may seem like a hint to some, but to me, that's not really relevant at all. The same way dragon heads represent monsters we can find in-game. With the exception of Monster Hunter 1 and Rise, all the dragon heads contained in the other titles' logos don't have any resemblance to any monster in his universe, and I believe those reflections are on the same boat. If they do symbolize anything, the closest thing would be a mirage, since the whole theme of the trailer was desert-based. Water though, not really. I also want to see it back, don't get me wrong, but with the information that we have at the moment, I would be extremely surprised if they did. Who knows? But what do you guys think? Would these changes improve the system from your perspective? Share your thoughts and opinions down below. A huge thank you to my Patreon supporters for supporting the channel and the content I create. If you wanna join the ranks, you can do so for only $1 a month, the link will be in the description. Don't forget to leave your thoughts and opinions down below, join our Discord server, engage with the community, and I hope to see you all next time.